Hey guys, welcome back. We're going to continue to talk today about the Civil War, the furnace of the Civil War. And we're going to talk a little bit about kind of the first battle and military technology that made this war much more deadly than other wars. This was the deadliest war in American history. Between 600 and 700,000 people died. From 1861 to 1865. At the same time, in China is the Taiping Rebellion. Taiping Tianguo is happening, and you lose so much more people, so many more people than we lose here in the United States. So the furnace of Civil War. So on this first slide, we're looking at Bull Run. This is a map, and if we were to zoom out, so you could see the entire country, what you would see is that this is close to Washington, D.C., which is in the eastern part of the United States, on the eastern coast, and then right in the middle. So we're looking at Manassas, as the battle was called, in the north, and Bull Run in the south. And this is the very first battle. There's two battles of Bull Run, but it's in the town of Manassas, only about just a few miles from, just a stone's throw, we would say in English, from Washington, D.C. And if you look on this map carefully, you will see Richmond further to the south, and Richmond is the capital of the Confederacy, and Washington, D.C. was the capital of the United States. And this is the first battle. This is where the first battle takes place. Now, if you look at the next slide, this is a puzzling picture. There's people having a picnic, and a woman comes in her dress, a couple of women, the men come in their suits, and they have food on a blanket. This is because in this very first battle, people in the North and the South believed that it was going to be a quick victory. This battle, this war was going to be over so fast, and the North was going to win, and the South wasn't going to stand a chance. And they came and brought their food and wanted to have a picnic and watch the battle. And what they saw wasn't nearly as exciting and fun as they had expected. And we're going to see some more pictures of that in just a moment. But if you look at the next slide, we see this first battle of Bull Run. It's taking place in July of 1861. And the Northern general is General McDowell. He has about 35,000 troops or soldiers. And he has ultimately about 2,900 casualties, 460 killed. Now remember, a casualty is a soldier who is killed, wounded, or taken prisoner, or disappears, meaning he has 2,900 people who can no longer fight. In the South, we have General Beauregard. He has 34,000 troops, and he has 2,000 casualties, just under 400 killed. And this should have been an easy victory for the North, should have been, but it wasn't. In fact, the South won the battle that day, and no one understands why the South won the battle, for sure, but what we do also know is that the South could have pushed the North all the way to Washington, D.C., and they could have captured the capital city of the United States. But they didn't do that either. They were tired, and they were probably not in good condition to march all the way to D.C. If we look at the next slide, we can see this is a picture of the battlefield after the battle, and it looks really kind of torn up. It looks like it's in bad condition. And the next slide, we also have a picture, and this is a picture of dead soldiers on the battlefield after the war. And we see lots of these pictures. They were photographers. Photography was a new piece of technology during the time of the Civil War. And so photographers were making use of this, and they were publishing photographs, not of dead bodies so much in the papers, but of people, of battlefields, of the carnage and the wreckage of war. But certainly we have some very famous pictures that come out of the Civil War, and this is one of them. On the next slide, we look at after Manassas. So after this battle in July of 1861, the country, they understand this is going to be a hard fight. The nation realizes this is going to be very difficult. And so the day after the battle, on July 22, Lincoln signs a bill, which means he signs a law, which would enlist or draft 500,000 soldiers for 3 years. This means that if you're drafted into the army, it means that you have to serve. The government says, we need you, you have to come and fight. Conscripted is another word we use, but 500,000 soldiers were going to have to serve for 3 years. He appointed a new general, General McClellan, and he had hoped for a bloodless war. Remember, McDowell had been the general, and he takes McDowell out of command and puts McClellan in command. And they hoped for a bloodless war. McClellan hopes for a bloodless war. And he had told Virginians that he did not come to free the slaves. Now, this is Lincoln's general. He told them he did not come to free the slaves. For him, it wasn't about slavery. He didn't like to attack the enemy because he was too worried that his own soldiers would be killed. Now, this was unlike Robert E. Lee and another general that finally wins the war for the North. His name was Grant. And they both were willing to have their soldiers killed so that they could win the war. That's the big difference between the North and the South, is the Northern generals really didn't fight hard, whereas the Southern generals fought really hard. On the next slide, we're going to talk about some military technology. And on this next slide, we see a picture of what in English we will call a hot air balloon. In this case, it's not a hot air balloon, it's a balloon. And it went up, and it was used for reconnaissance, and that's a big word. But reconnaissance means to gather information. So you can imagine, at this time, we don't have airplanes. So you can imagine the balloon rising up in the air, and the person can look around and can see everything around them. They can see where the enemy troops are. And so they can make a note, and they can come back down, and then they can tell their commander, hey, you've got 1,000 troops here, 10,000 soldiers here, and you have some soldiers back over here. It's a very useful information. And so this was used for reconnaissance during the Battle of Bull Run in July of 1861. Other kinds of military technology that begin to make their way into wartime in the Civil War was a rifled barrel. Now what we're looking at here are two kinds of barrels. Now the end of a gun is called a barrel. On the left side of this picture, we see what's called a smooth bore, meaning inside, if you put your finger inside that barrel, it's smooth. It's completely smooth. And the bullet is a ball. It's just like a little ball, and it drops right down in there, or it's a slug. Maybe it has a little point on the end, but it's a slug, and it drops right down in there. And it will, when it comes out of the end of the gun, when it's fired, it kind of moves around because there's nothing keeping it on course. Now what we see on the right side is what's called a rifled barrel. And so there's grooves, and you can see those grooves, and so when the bullet comes out of the gun, that bullet rotates, it spins. And when that bullet spins, it keeps it on course a little bit better. If you ever watched baseball, you know that someone who throws a knuckleball, which moves around, it's not very accurate. And someone who throws a curveball or a fastball, it spins and it goes much more directly where the pitcher wants that ball to go. And so this means that you can shoot the bullet further. You can shoot it from 80 meters or about 80 yards to 400 yards or 400 meters accurately. And so this changes how war is fought. You can fight from further away. If you're on a horse, you can shoot more accurately. But it also decreases the use of horse riders or cavalry, because the rifle, the battle can actually take place from behind trees, changes the nature of war. Now, on the next slide, we see another one. And what this is, there's two things that happen here. One is you have pictures of rifles, and then you have a white image with two bullets on it. And they had originally not been able to use a rifled bullet because, as you can imagine, with the grooves, the bullet will have to spin as you put it into the gun, and you have to put that bullet into the top of the gun and let it spin all the way down. Well, that takes a lot of time. And so they came up with two things. One, they would hollow out the ends of that bullet, and you can see that represented on the picture on the right side of that white image. And so when that bullet was fired, that bottom part would expand just a little bit, and it catches those rifle grooves and it spins. Now, that meant that they could make the bullet just a little bit smaller, so when you dropped it in, it just dropped right in. And then when you fired it, it pushed out and it fired out. And so that made it much more easy to fire accurately and also quickly. So the second thing that they come up with is, instead of loading the gun from the top of the barrel, called a muzzle loader, you could load it from the back of the gun that you hold right here, and that's called a breech loader. So you just put it right in and then you fire rather than having to drop it. And that was not as widespread at the end of the Civil War. The next slide we have, what I described to you before with the skirt expanding, that's called a mini ball, or Minier was the name of the man who designed or kind of invented this. And you can see the military technology slide. The bottom picture, you have two mini balls that hit and they collapsed and they squashed into each other. On the left side, you have a model of someone's wrist who was hit with the Minier ball. And then on the top right corner, you see, in the middle, you see a Minier ball that's not been fired. It's just a conical shape. We also have submarines. Looking at the next slide, submarines get their first use during the Civil War. And in this case, this submarine that you're looking at on this image had a harpoon on the end and this long pole, and at the end of this long pole was a torpedo, a bomb. And so they rammed the submarine. The sailors would rotate their hands like this, and it would propel the submarine forward. And when they rammed into the ship, then instead of going forward, they have to turn and go backwards. And then at this point, the submarine will move back this way. So they successfully rammed the ship, and then they turn around and push, they rotate this way, but then they sink to the bottom and they disappeared. And no one knew anything about what happened to them until about the year 2003 or 2004. And then they found the submarine called the CSS Hunley, and they brought it up. And all the men, of course, they're dead, but all of the men were still in the submarine. On the next slide, we see the machine gun. The machine gun was actually initially called the Gatling gun because the man by the name of Dr. Gatling invented this. And he invented it so that he could save lives, because most people, believe it or not, most people on the battlefield that died did not die from being shot. They died from being cold, hungry, or sick. So his idea was, well, let's create one gun that can do the work of 10 men. And if we can create one gun that can do the work of 10 men, then 9 men don't have to get cold, hungry, or sick, and we will save lives. Well, as we know, the machine gun probably does not save lives very much. And that's where we're going to end it for this lesson, and we'll see you in the next lesson, next part, next video lesson, and we're going to talk about the Emancipation Proclamation. We'll see you guys then. Bye-bye.